Thank you, Lloyd, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words today, this morning. I'd love to talk to you about a lot of the things that Hydro-Quebec is doing, but I'll kind of maybe constrain that to some of the things we're doing in the Northeast and get right into this study that we've been participating in recently. So just to give you a little bit of an idea, Hydro-Quebec is one of the biggest electricity utilities actually in North America. We're the biggest in Canada. Can everybody hear me okay? No? Is that better? So we produce about half of the hydropower in Canada. It is our principal source of energy. It's about 99% actually of our output is hydro. So we do have a little bit of off-grid within the province, but everything that we are selling onto our export markets is from our hydro fleet. Big fleet, close to 37,000 megawatts of installed capacity that provides both for the Quebec load and for a significant portion of the exports that we send into the Northeast U.S., as well as into Ontario and New Brunswick in Canada. We've been involved in the export markets throughout the Northeast for quite some time now, actually, since before even deregulation. Within those markets, we've been actually selling into New York for a little over 100 years now. When markets deregulated, of course, it was a big opportunity for us. We do have a system that is very robust, that does produce a lot of energy, about 205 terawatt hours per year. So you can see here about 170 terawatt hours from one year to the next is for Quebec load, and then we send about 30 to 35, depending on the year, into those export markets. You see a little bit what our footprint looks like up on this slide. So probably about half goes into New England, our best market basically, and the one that has the highest demand and some of the highest prices in the U.S. Why are we involved in a conference like this? You could probably ask the question. Well, it's because transmission is at the heart of all of our activities within Quebec, but especially within our export markets. We not only have generation sources that are very far from our load centers, and when I say far, we're talking about 600 miles, basically due north. So building out the transmission grid and making it robust and very highly performing has been a major thing for us for many, many years now. And we are also asynchronous with all of our neighbors. So we are actually linked through DC ties to all of our markets from Ontario all the way along to New England and into New Brunswick. So we're a little bit of a different beast, I would say, in that way. DC transmission links and high voltage DC lines into the US have been on our agenda for a very long time. We actually have one that's about 900 miles long that goes from our facilities, northern James Bay, all the way into the Boston load pocket. That line has been running for 27 years now. We're looking to reproduce that type of an arrangement into New England as fast as we can. So initiatives such as the ones that's going to be discussed today are kind of very close to our hearts. We work in a region, of course, that has a lot of really ambitious clean energy goals, not necessarily shared with the entire continent, but it's become kind of a basis for the business model that we put forward. So we do have a clean source of energy. We have one that is actually very reactive as well, very flexible. So while we have been recently and up until this year and probably for the next 20 years, because we have just signed a big contract with Massachusetts for 9.45 terawatt hours a year, we are a big energy supplier, and that is pretty much a one-way relationship. But we know that we can do other things with our reservoir system. We've got 176 terawatt hours of reservoir capacity that serves both Quebec load and serves our export markets. So we're looking at a little bit of a change in our business model and the way that we operate internally to go from a major energy supplier to more of an entity that can be an integrator of intermittent renewables on a much wider regional scale than what we do today. We have actually done that within Quebec, 37,000 megawatts of installed capacity on the hydro side, but we have another 3,700 in wind that we balance ourselves. So we've learned to balance that wind, to understand its intermittency with our hydro system, and I think we're ready to go that extra step now and to start doing it outside of our borders. So we've kind of been asking ourselves, how do we get to these great emissions reductions goals that we have throughout the Northeast, which are pretty much 80% reductions by 2050, if you look at the New England states and New York. Canada, our major markets, so both Quebec and Ontario, are pretty much on the same level. We're looking at that same type of decarbonization. And we, a couple of years ago, got together with Columbia University with a group that is run by Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, and they work with Deep Decarbonization Pathways Project to look at how you can decarbonize a region or a country to a certain level by a certain time. We sat down with them, and their major question for us was, how does your system work, and how can we get together with you and start to share data so that we can better understand how you could integrate more within the Northeast. So this brought forth this study that was actually completed, launched this year in April, and it's looking at how you can decarbonize the Northeast. So I'm going to go through just a couple of, really quickly, some of the assumptions that were made here. I think the first one was that the Northeast is going to have to build out pretty much all of the renewable energy that it can, all of the solar, all of the wind offshore and onshore that it can. But that if we have a better coordination with Hydro-Quebec, because we're already selling into that market, there can maybe be a little bit of an economic savings that are involved. So you look here on this slide, you can see some of the major assumptions that go into this. We're looking at things like you have to change a lot of those end energy uses from whatever they're using right now, probably a fossil fuel, to electricity. You're going to have to decarbonize your electricity generation, and then you're going to have to put a whole lot of energy efficiency measures on board. So those are kind of the three pillars. That brought us to looking at, so what's on the table today in terms of policy? And there are policies out there. Massachusetts, as I said, has just launched a couple of big initiatives, one that garnered this hydro contract for the next 20 years, another offshore wind initiative. We looked at the same thing in New York and tried to plot out on a 20, 30-year period, what is this going to mean? So it's going to mean a certain reduction in greenhouse gases, but it's not enough. So there's definitely, we're not going to get there with what we have right now in terms of public policy. That was kind of the first major conclusion. The big question is, so how do we get to this nice blue line that brings us all the way down to this really great level? And I guess the first thing is this massive deployment of everything that is possible within the region. But that, of course, brings about this whole intermittency question. So we're talking in this study about probably a 70 or a 75% penetration of variable renewables, the vast majority of those probably being offshore wind. Nobody really has a system that works like that in the world, that is not directly interconnected, like, for example, Denmark is, with a lot of neighbors that have a lot of extra energy that can be flowed onto their grid to back that intermittency up, and those neighbors can actually absorb some of that excess power. So the Northeast, I mean, the obvious partner is Hydro-Quebec with our reservoir system. So then we looked at, okay, under the current situation, there are a number of different costs. There's some infrastructure costs, so the wires, the hardware that's involved. That's pretty much a fixed cost. If this region was going to do it on its own, it would have to build out a lot of new clean energy, and it would have to build a lot of balancing resources as well. So that kind of brings us to this level of cost, if you will. And there's no real cost estimate that's associated with this, but there is in the study. So I would kind of advise everybody to take a look at the study, to take a look at some of the details. We then looked at what would better coordination with Quebec mean. And by coordination, we meant perhaps more imports of our energy, but definitely much more transmission between our grids. So right now, within the Northeast US, we have about 4,000 megawatts of interconnection capacity with New York and with New England. The study basically presumed that we would be able to go up by an additional 9,000. Big step. To be quite honest with you, we've been trying to get a 1,000 megawatt line built into New England now for the past 10 years. Touch wood, I hope it's going to happen soon, because that's what's going to be able to let this Massachusetts contract go forward. But it's a tough one. Everybody knows about the public acceptability issues with transmission. We've pretty much hit those within the New England market. But this increased coordination, so the transmission plus the increased generation bit, would actually allow us to reduce some of the costs of the new energy within New England and New York, Because those last projects, the ones that are the most costly, the offshore wind projects that are not optimal, the ones that have the highest price tag associated with them, be it on the technical side or the social acceptability side, might not have to be done. Because this extra energy will be able to come in from Hydro-Quebec. We'll be able as well to absorb any excess generation that's happening in the Northeast. And what that does is it basically means that there's less clean energy that will have to be developed in that region, less balancing resources locally, so basically fewer chemical batteries put on the system, and we get this cost savings. And the cost savings actually ends up being about $4 billion. That's an annual cost savings at a 2050 horizon, according to the study. Now, there's a few different scenarios looked at, so there's a few different figures in there. That's probably the best one, but there are varying degrees depending on whether or not there's wind coming from Quebec, because we still have a lot of wind resources we could build, whether or not there's hydro. But the idea is here. The idea that a hydropower resource like ours, or for example, and I have a couple of colleagues from Manitoba Hydro in the room, like Manitoba Hydros, can actually not only pick up that intermittency balancing role, but they can do it at a lower cost. So I advise everybody to take a look at this study. It's a high-level study, so the technical people in the room might be looking for a few more figures and a few more things in there, but we purposely did it this way because this is addressed basically to legislators and public policy people that need to look at this, that need to realize that if we're going to get to this point by 2050, there has to be things that are done now, and we have to kind of change our thinking as of now. So not only has this been an interesting exercise for us within the Northeast, even within our company it's been interesting, because we have to change our mindset as well, from being an energy supplier to basically coming up with a way that we can value our reservoir storage capacity differently. And by differently, I mean sometimes selling, but sometimes absorbing extra generation. We've started doing that with our neighbors in Ontario. We have a short-term agreement in place for next, I think, 6 years now, whereby we not only sell energy and capacity to Ontario, we have a capacity swap with them, but we also absorb some of their excess generation. Ontario does a lot of nuclear, and it's got a lot of wind on its system, so there are times when there's just too much generation on their system with respect to load. We take that on. So basically, when I say absorbing, we're turning off our turbines. We're using that excess generation from Ontario for our own load. And when it's not there anymore, we turn on our turbines again, and we can either flow to the Quebec load or we can flow back to Ontario when they need it. It's the beauty and the flexibility of the hydropower system. We can go in most of our facilities from pretty much a cold start to full production somewhere between 6 and 7 minutes. We're rarely ever at a cold start, and we're rarely ever at the maximum generation. So it's a little less long than that even when you look at it. But it's a major advantage for this entire region in looking at how can you go through the energy transition in the best way and in the least costly way. So this is something that we share. I think I mentioned Manitoba Hydro. BC Hydro kind of has the same role with respect to California, but hydropower producers throughout the U.S. are starting to talk about this a lot. I was at the National Hydropower Association General Congress in Washington not too long ago, and everyone is speaking about this new role for hydro. So we have been kind of a very low-key industry for a very long time, producing at a fairly stable level for whoever our load servers are. And now what we see is with the energy transition, we're going to have to start thinking a little bit differently about how we use our resource. Very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation, and hope we're going to have a lot of interesting conversations today. Thank you.